Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Bob Kim. I am the Executive Director of Education Law Center. This is the first of three webinars that ELC is hosting related to Trump 2.0 and sort of where we're going to go from here. The title of this webinar is called What Do We Do Now? No Vouchers. Public funds are for public schools. The second webinar, which we will host in December, will be related to school funding issues. And the third webinar in January will be on student rights and combating discrimination. So stay tuned for those two additional webinars in this series on how to address pressing issues that are now arising now that we know the results of the federal election and sort of looking forward to what will happen in the future. I've got to start by saying that it's funny, I was just emailing somebody about Trump 2.0 and sort of developing legal and other strategies to address the situation. And I signed my email. I meant to sign it best, best comma Bob, but I accidentally wrote beset. And the person said, "Did you mean to say beset?" And I said, "No, but actually that is not a bad word to use in this situation." We are beset in some ways as we look forward to all the challenges that we have to face now that the election results are known. Um, I will start by saying that what Trump is planning, we know a lot from Project 2025, and in his own words, one of the things that we'll talk about today in this webinar is that the Republicans intend to pass and sign a federal private school voucher bill. So that is on tap for discussion today. But there's many more issues also that we know are likely to happen, potential or likely actions in the next Trump administration. We are thinking about and tracking issues ranging from the extreme, the elimination of the Department of Education and many federal funding streams that benefit states and locals. We're thinking about changes to statutes and regulations potentially down the line that would widen the scope of who gets access to public school funds, including religious schools and private schools and individuals. And there's a bunch of civil rights laws and issues that we're also tracking and developing responses to, ranging from Title IX to immigration issues to racial justice issues, censorship issues, and so forth. So there's no shortage of topics that we must be aware of as we move forward, and we will be in partnership with many of you and with our stakeholders and all kinds of advocacy organizations to develop a full-throated response to many of these issues in the weeks and months ahead. But for right now, what I'm very happy to do is to kick off this series on this topic of vouchers and what we're going to do in the next era on that topic. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our two co-panelists today. Jessica Levin, who is ELC's litigation director and also the director of Public Funds, Public Schools, and also Josh Cowen, who is a senior fellow at ELC and is on generous loan to us from his position as professor at Michigan State University. Josh is also the author of a book that I sort of carry around with me called The Privateers: How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. So pick that up. It's a great stocking stuffer if you haven't already read it. So without further ado, I would like to turn over this session to Jessica Levin.
Thanks so much, Bob, and thank you to everybody for being here today. We know this is an incredibly busy time, and we appreciate you taking this hour to talk with us about vouchers, which we, and I know many of you, feel are one of the most pressing issues that are going to impact us over the next 4 years, and one of the biggest threats to public education. Why are we talking about vouchers today? I think we are mostly on the same page, but why is this so pressing right now? Because First of all, very recently, the scale of the threat that vouchers pose to public education and civil rights has grown exponentially in the last few years, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And also, of course, because the Trump administration is prioritizing the expansion of vouchers, including with proposed federal voucher legislation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those things. Very briefly, I know that many of you know a lot about vouchers, but to make sure that we're all on the same page, it's important to remember that private school vouchers come in many, many forms, and that's deliberate by those who push voucher programs because they know, and we just saw in this recent election, that the public doesn't like vouchers, and I know Josh is going to talk more about that. So they have to hide the program's true nature, and they also have to give them a lot of different names having to do with freedom and promises that are, of course, going to be broken. So conventional vouchers pay for a student's private school tuition with public funds. That's the oldest type of voucher. Education savings account vouchers, called ESAs, are public funds deposited into a personal account that can be used for a student's private school tuition, as well as a wide range of other private education expenses, like tutoring, online coursework, transportation, and often even homeschooling. Tax credit scholarship vouchers, another kind of voucher, provide individuals or corporations with a tax credit, often 100% or close to it, to send money that they would otherwise owe in state taxes to private organizations that then hand out vouchers. Really just a way to launder what is public funds and what is money that should go to the government to fund public goods, including public education, is being laundered away and diverted to private education expenses. And remember this type of voucher because we're going to talk about it in the federal context in a moment. Finally, I really want to alert everyone to a type of voucher that is flying even more under the radar than the others, but is incredibly dangerous. These are refundable tax credits for private education expenses. Now, those have been around for a long time, but on a much smaller scale. In the last couple of years, we have seen state legislatures enacting voucher programs that are funded through refundable tax credits. So a family pays for their child's private education expenses and then can expect to receive a refund, a tax credit refund from their state for many thousands of dollars, a full voucher amount like we see in other states. And this is really insidious because it is even more inequitable than other vouchers in that only families that can afford to front the money for their child's private school education are able to use these programs, but they are passing in places like Arkansas and Oklahoma, and we expect more proposals like that this year, and we want you to be aware of them. Again, also really briefly, because I know that many of you are aware of the myriad reasons to oppose voucher programs, but I want to name them really quickly at the top of this hour so that we all remember how dangerous these programs are. First, they harm academic outcomes. So more and more research is showing that students who use vouchers experience worse educational outcomes than their public school peers. Second, vouchers rob students of their civil rights. Many of our federal and state civil rights protections do not apply when students take a voucher and enter a private school. And vouchers also explicitly fund schools that have discriminatory policies against students with disabilities, LGBTQ students, and other vulnerable groups. Third, vouchers exacerbate racial and socioeconomic segregation. Many of you know that the origins of private school vouchers are in the massive resistance to school integration around the Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision, when vouchers were used to fund segregation academies and let white families flee from integration in public schools in the South. And even today, vouchers exacerbate school segregation along both racial and other lines. And there is increasing evidence coming out in states like Ohio and Indiana of that. Fourth, vouchers lack quality and accountability standards. We don't know that students using vouchers, we have no way to know what quality of education they're getting, though we know that from the information we do have, we know the quality is often very low. And vouchers also waste public funds. We've all seen news stories coming out of Arizona and Florida and other large voucher programs about the fraud and abuse that happens with the public funds in voucher programs. And finally, Vouchers undermine the public schools that serve the vast majority of students across the country. Over 90% of students in the US still attend public schools. Vouchers both directly draw funding away from those public schools, funds that they can't afford to lose, and also concentrate higher needs students in public schools because, for example, private schools refuse to serve students with disabilities and other high needs students. So, despite all of this and ever mounting evidence about the harms of vouchers, a little more than half the states now have some type of voucher program. Depending how you count, it's about 29 of the 50 states plus DC. Some are quite small, but many are expanding, and this is a tactic of the voucher lobby to start with a small voucher program and then expand it and expand it until, in many places, it has even become universal. So now we have the phenomenon of universal vouchers. In 2022, Arizona was the first state to universalize its voucher program, and now 12 states have universal or near universal voucher eligibility, meaning that any student in the state, regardless of how wealthy their family is, regardless of whether they have ever been enrolled in public school, can get this public subsidy for private education expenses. And in some of those states, vouchers now cost $1 billion per year, states like Arizona and Ohio, or even multiple billions in Florida. So what do we face with the recent federal election and from a Trump administration? We face both emboldened state legislatures to pass more voucher programs or to expand their existing voucher programs. And of course, the composition of some state legislatures has changed unfavorably to potentially allow more voucher laws to pass. And then we also face the threat of federal voucher legislation, most notably in the form of the Educational Choice for Children Act, the ECA. Federal voucher legislation was tried in the first Trump administration, and it did not gain much traction. We are watching this very closely, though, because the Trump administration and others have made it clear that this is a top priority for the GOP, and so it needs to be a priority for us to fight. This is in the form of a tax credit voucher bill, here funded by federal tax credits. It's also in what we would call an ESA form because the range of expenses that can be paid with these vouchers is not just tuition, but a very wide range of private educational expenses. And this bill really forces states to adopt a federally funded voucher program. I'm going to talk about lots of tools and advocates who are working against this in the next segment of our webinar, but we wanted to give you an overview of what the landscape looks like right now, how it's changed dramatically in the last few years, and the dramatic changes that we might be facing and that we need to fend off over the next 4 years.
Thank you, Jessica. And that was really great. And I think we'll turn it over to Josh momentarily to sort of talk about the actual election, what happened, and sort of what this means in the coming future with the Republican trifecta in the federal government. I'm curious also as a placeholder question about how the ECA bill, the federal bill, will overlay on top of state voucher policies and laws now. So it's sort of like a double potential whammy that we want to watch out for moving forward. But with that, let me turn it over to Josh to talk about what happened on Election Day and what it means for us moving forward.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Jessica. I always learn a lot listening to you all. That's part of why I'm here this year. So vouchers went 0 for 3 on Election Day in the 3 states where voters actually got a say on these things. So Colorado, uh, Nebraska, and Kentucky. And I'll talk about each one of these things really briefly because they're a little different, but they're all the sort of the take-home point is that vouchers went 0 for 3. Now, these guys, the voucher lobby, pee their pants and throw ketchup on at the walls whenever you use the word voucher. So let's be clear what we're talking about here. Jessica gave a good overview. They hate the word voucher because it polls poorly. And you see on election day, it results poorly for them when voters actually get a say of these things. Anything, either through the tax code or through direct spending, that devotes public dollars to private K-12 tuition and requires parents to either withdraw their child from public school or never have their child in public school to begin with, that's a voucher if it meets those 2 criteria. And again, Jessica did a great job sort of sort of overviewing all these different mechanisms that they can use, but these are all vouchers. So in Colorado, there was a bill that that would have changed the Constitution and added expansive language that was actually very vague to what was already in place in Colorado. So there's already a lot of school choice in Colorado. There are charter schools. There's a very famous system of open enrollment in charter school, which allows, in district schools, which allows parents to live in one district and move to another. A similar system exists in most states, including my own, where we don't have vouchers, but 1 in 4 children every day in Michigan go to a public school that they don't live in the residential area near. And then the Colorado Amendment also added this sort of vague language that parents had the right to direct their education. And, who's not for parents having a say in their child's education? So that bill actually came closest, got on just under a majority in Colorado. And it came closest of the 3 states. I have some sort of personal ideas about why that happened. I think it has to do with the vagary of the language and also the fact that somewhat counterintuitively, because it's out west, Colorado actually has the most densely populated urban areas of those 3 states. And one of the themes here that I'm going to kind of whip through is rural voters on a bipartisan basis really dislike these voucher schemes for the first and foremost simple reason that there are very few private schools in rural communities, and communities really rely on their public schools to be centers of community in those places as well. Next, we go to Nebraska. So Nebraska, 57% of voters actually pulled a law off the books. It was a bill that had been really shepherded through the unicameral legislature there by a state senator named Luann Linehan, who perhaps coincidentally or not, whose daughter is the communications director, Betsy DeVos's 501c4 voucher lobby group, the American Federation for Children. These are very small networks that these folks operate in, as a theme of my book, The Privateers. But there was a law on the books that they passed. It had yet to take effect. And in a quirk of Nebraska lawmaking is that direct voters get a chance to weigh in on these things, and they can pull laws off the books once the legislature has made them. And that's precisely what they did 2 weeks ago. 57% of those voters, and I'll note that Donald Trump won that state by a pretty considerable margin. Moving to Kentucky, Kentucky put a ballot on an initiative on the ballot to amend the Constitution. There's some very firm protections in Kentucky's Constitution, as there are in many states, I might add. It's something Jessica and Bob can talk more further about. But Kentucky has strong language in the Constitution that prohibits the use of public dollars for private or a separate sector of education. So they were going to amend this thing. And explicit language on the bill, by the way. You'll hear the voucher lobby say, oh, voters were confused. It was very, very clear. Public dollars for private tuition on this ballot initiative. 65% of voters rejected this thing. All 120 counties rejected this thing. 119 of those counties by double digits. Donald Trump won the state of Kentucky by almost exact margin, 65-35. So, the take-home point on election day was that voters on a bipartisan basis, red state voters, purple state voters, blue state voters, blue county voters, red county voters, all rejected these things. And my view is that, I've been in this space for a long time, talking to people, studying these issues, writing about these issues. If one theme of the election was how do the promises of economic sort of numbers and security and what politicians in Washington say is happening in the country, how do those promises help me and my family? That theme is really part of what happens when vouchers come to the ballot box directly, because whatever folks' other political persuasions, maybe they love Donald Trump, but they look around their communities and say, I like my public school. This place is where we do Friday night football. This place is where my 4-H club meets. This place is where they gave out community meals during the pandemic. I don't really want this thing to get defunded or to lose money. And I know that Betsy DeVos's voucher scheme 150 miles away might help some kids already in private school there, like the data show, but it's not going to help my kids and my family. And that's really what you see across the states on this. I do want to say one more thing before I kind of yield things back. And that's sort of who's behind these things. And that is the answer to that question helps explain why you see some red state legislatures in particular, all state legislatures, but especially red state legislatures proposing, in many cases, passing voucher laws, as Jessica described at the top. These There are three billionaires in the United States and a whole network of folks funded through those billionaires. Betsy DeVos, of course, we're talking about vouchers. We have to talk about Betsy DeVos. Charles Koch, octogenarian oil and gas magnate in the center of the country. And then Jeff Yass, TikTok billionaire based in Pennsylvania, sort of the new kid on the block when it comes to billionaires backing vouchers. These folks fund and contribute to almost all of the voucher advocacy in the United States. There's also a group based in Wisconsin called the Lindy and Harry Bradley Foundation, which funds an enormous number of litigation groups, think tanks, voucher advocacy organizations, and most of the pro-voucher research in the country as well. But these are all sort of tightly aligned networks of folks that fund these things. And the way they do it on the advocacy side is they go after red state Republican legislators, and particularly in Republican primaries. So you don't see a lot of this spending trying to pick off Democrats or lobby Democrats even. To give you a concrete example, NBC News did some deep dive reporting out of Iowa and to some extent Arkansas last year on the volume of dollars that Betsy DeVos's organization was spending just to knock out 7 rural Republican legislators, including the Republican chair of the Iowa House Education Committee, just to assemble votes to get a voucher bill through that state. The reason it takes billionaires and the reason it takes primarying out these folks and threatening them with losing their seats is because of things that happened like they did 16 days ago on election day, which is that when you actually ask voters about this stuff and not legislators who are afraid of losing their seats because they're going to get primaried by national dollars, vouchers fail at the ballot box time and time again. No voucher bill has ever survived a statewide ballot initiative, and that's a streak that continued through election day. I think I'll stop there and sort of yield back to Jessica, but sort of take home point here is this is not a grassroots movement at all. This is very top down, billionaire driven push to kind of make the world the way they see it, the way they think that it should. That means that there's a fight against this every single election and every single legislative session. But the good news is actual voters, actual grassroots parents, actual educators, actual communities really do oppose these things. And the volume of folks and the volume of voices really is on the side of public schools and against school vouchers. So, Bob, Jessica.
Thank you, Josh. That was great. And we are going to turn to Jessica in a minute just to talk about what are we going to do now? What ought we to do now? What can we, how do we fight back? And so I think that'll be an interesting segment here. And then also, just as a reminder, put your questions, because this is a conversation, put your questions in the Q&A button down there at the bottom of your Zoom screen, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And we will try to address some of these questions just in just a few minutes when we turn to that. But right now, I think we'd like to hear back from Jessica about strategies. What can we do now? And so back to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Bob and Josh. Yes, so we all know that we are facing a difficult few years. We all know that there are huge challenges ahead, and we want to be really concrete about steps that we can take now in the very short term and in the medium and longer term. What can we do together? So how can Education Law Center and our Public Funds, Public Schools campaign help? What can we do, and how can we work together with all of you? So I want to be as concrete as possible about the things that we do and how everyone can plug into those efforts and increase those efforts. Before that, I want to say just really quickly as a beacon of hope that although the growth of voucher programs is explosive in the last few years, that can't be denied, it is not unstoppable, and it is not inevitable. So a few examples. Many states have held off vouchers year after year, despite a lot of money and a lot of resources going into pushing them in state legislatures. A few examples are Idaho, Texas. Also, voucher programs have been stopped in the courts, most recently in Kentucky a couple of years ago, in South Carolina just this year in a case that PFPS was involved in. Also, It's possible for a legislature to nix an existing voucher program. This happened in Illinois last year when the legislature deliberately decided to sunset the tax credit program in Illinois. And finally, as Josh just extensively explained, in this November's election, 3 states rejected vouchers or constitutional amendments that could lead to vouchers, including the Nebraska referendum that repealed that state's recently enacted voucher law. So there are so many avenues to halt and roll back voucher programs. And what I'm about to talk about are a bunch of different ways to contribute to that effort, and what Public Funds Public Schools is here to help you all do in achieving those goals. So what can we do now and over the next 4 years to halt and roll back voucher growth? I'm going to talk about a few different areas: legal advocacy, policy and legislative advocacy, research, and communications and partnerships. So I want to start with legal because Education Law Center is a legal organization. We are one of the only organizations in the country engaging in legal analysis and advocacy against vouchers. There are so many wonderful organizations working on this issue, and we are aiming to support you and help lead the way in legal advocacy against voucher programs. So don't forget the power of the law and the courts. Some courts are going to be more difficult than others. That's undeniable, but there are avenues in both state and federal courts to fight vouchers, and that has been successful, as I mentioned, just very recently in South Carolina, recently in Kentucky, and going all the way back to victories like in Nevada in 2016 when we were able to successfully have the Nevada Supreme Court knock down what was actually would have been the country's first universal voucher law, but it never got off the ground because the court invalidated it. So lawsuits are not always the right strategy, and they never can stand alone as a strategy. They always have to be coupled with advocacy and grassroots organizing and public education campaigns. But sometimes they are the strategy to knock out a voucher program in a state, either one that was recently enacted or one that's been going on for a while. So we are going to look to file more lawsuits in state courts to both stop new voucher programs from starting or to challenge existing programs based on the evidence of their negative effects. So we need your help in identifying where lawsuits might be viable. We need your help in legal analysis if your organization has that capacity, but we also need help in analyzing the political landscape, the advocacy landscape, the communications landscape in your state. And we welcome you to get in touch with us if you think a lawsuit might be the route to go in your state. We also provide technical assistance to pretty much everyone who is considering or engaging in voucher litigation across the country, and we are eager to provide more technical assistance and advice, so please get in touch with us if you are considering voucher litigation or if you know of someone who is considering voucher litigation and might need some support. Amicus briefs are also a very important tool in the legal realm for fighting vouchers. We need to support those who are filing filing lawsuits against voucher programs. So there is the option to write amicus briefs, but even if your organization doesn't have attorneys, doesn't have a legal arm, there are opportunities to sign on to amicus briefs that Public Funds Public Schools and ELC write or that others write. We're happy to help connect you with those opportunities to add your name and your voice to amicus briefs, to friend of the court briefs, and tell the courts what a broad coalition of organizations are supporting these lawsuits. And then finally, I want to mention helping to oppose pro-voucher litigation. The litigation around vouchers is not only coming from pro-public education organizations, but some of the most impactful litigation in education and writ large has been in the form of pro-voucher litigation from large organizations like the Institute for Justice and other pro-voucher legal organizations over the last few years. That was in cases like Espinoza and Carson, which are in the Supreme Court over the last few years, and dramatically expanded the public funds that are going to private education, and also the public funds that are going to religious organizations. So we need to pay attention to these cases, including cases right now that are trying to exempt private religious organizations receiving public money from anti-discrimination laws. And contact us if you're interested in that. It's incredibly important and dangerous litigation that we need everyone to help oppose this litigation through signing on to amicus briefs and other strategies like that. Finally, in the legal realm, I want to mention federal litigation. As there is more federal activity on vouchers, we need to think about federal litigation, and this is not unprecedented. During the first Trump administration, Public Funds Public Schools and our allies represented plaintiffs, school districts, and parents across the country who sued Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos when she tried to divert federal COVID funds that were meant for public schools to private schools instead. And we won, even though Trump was president, even though the judge that presided over our case had been appointed by President Trump. We won a nationwide injunction against Betsy DeVos's illegal policy. And the court ordered a nationwide injunction of DeVos's plan, and that kept approximately $1 billion from being robbed from public schools. So this is possible. It's possible to succeed in federal litigation against the Trump administration, and that's something that we all need to think about and support as well. Okay, moving away from Bob, do you want to say something? Do you want to chime in?
Finish up, and then I'll start with questions. No, finish up.
Okay, so legislative and policy advocacy, I want to run through a few of the things that Public Funds Public Schools can help with and that you all can plug into. Tracking bills. Use the PFPS bill tracker to track voucher legislation in your state and similar legislation across the country that might be able to help you in the fight in your state, but also help us fill in gaps in this legislation, bills that we might be missing, and help us find hidden bills, like voucher bills that are hidden in budget bills. Work with legislators. You all have relationships with legislators in your state who might be able to put up the fight against voucher bills. And PFPS can, for example, help you write questions for friendly legislators or help you analyze bills and figure out what should be asked in hearings. Submit testimony to state legislatures. And again, we can help you with that. We can provide you with research to support your testimony. State-specific policy briefs. PFPS has written them to support anti-voucher efforts in places like Illinois, New York, Mississippi, Texas, where our policy brief was put into the legislative record. We are also so happy to co-author with organizations in the states who want to co-author fact sheets or policy briefs. We also want you to tell us what you need fact sheets on, what topics you need fact sheets on so that we can help you have talking points to talk to legislators and others in your community. Writing legislation and model legislation, such as for data collection, so that we can have a better handle on the harms that vouchers are causing by filling in the gaps that state legislators refuse to mandate the collection of this data, and we can help with model legislation. Again, analyzing bills, commenting on federal regulations, or signing on to comments that we and others write. So those are some of the many legislative and policy activities that you can engage in. Research. Please use the PFPS research page to support the points that you want to make about academic harms, segregation, undermining of public schools. Go on our research page and find a compendium of voucher research. We also have original research, like our report on the fiscal consequences of voucher programs. We welcome you to use that. Tell us what you think should be researched. What are the most pressing research questions? And we can relay those to people in the academy who want to engage in voucher legislation and want to investigate these questions. And finally, use the new PFPS private school data tool. This can tell you, for example, how disproportionate the service of students of different races is in public and private schools in your state, and what voucher programs will fund if you fund private schools in your state, how they will disproportionately fund education for white students or high income students, for example. And then communications. Do things like writing op-eds. And again, we can support you with research and other information. Do webinars. We love inviting state advocates to share their tips with each other on our PFPS webinar series. Share information, share blasts, share Josh's wonderful newsletter, which comes out every couple of weeks on very timely voucher issues. We're happy to come talk to via Zoom or in person, meetings of your organization or people in your community. And finally, press. If you're getting press requests and you need information and research to give to the press, or you want to talk to a member of the media and then refer them to Josh or refer them to someone else at Education Law Center or another national organization, we are happy to facilitate that. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not make a plug to make a donation to PFPS. I know we are all looking for support for this work. We can't continue to support all the state and local efforts that are going on without some financial support for public funds, public schools, and ELC. So we encourage you to do that if you are able. So those are just a few of the ways that things that we've done in the past during Trump 1 and afterward, and ways that we can work together. And we hope to hear from so many of you.
My gosh, thank you, Jessica. So many things and really helpful. I just want to turn back and as we get to the Q&A, just one brief set of state-related questions for advocates out there, and then turning then back to the federal side. But on the state side, just one or two nuggets from each of you on what was the messaging that worked in those states that turned back the ballot initiatives? For other states like Texas and others, what would be the right kinds of messages, data, talking points, approaches to defeat those ballot initiatives in other states? And then the second state question, just to noodle on, is, how do you craft legislation? What is an initial approach to crafting legislation that would keep public funds in public schools, especially in light of the cases Jessica mentioned, Espinoza, Carson, that seem to create a green light as far as the federal courts are concerned? Then how do you then craft legislation at the state level? So state level messaging to defeat ballot initiatives, and then also one or two pathway nuggets on how to craft legislation. So anyone wants to sort of chime in on that, that would be great.
I I think I'll just sort of take that first part, and then Jessica, I'm sure has some thoughts. I've spoken in and with folks in those three states, but it was not part of organizational activity in the push up to the ballots. And one thing that strikes me though about the messaging is there are some big top line themes. So as an example, and folks who follow me and some of the stuff that I speak about and write about know that study after study and report after report from our media folks has shown that the vast majority of voucher users already were in private school to begin with. And that is both sort of an issue of fairness, but it's also an issue of the effect that this thing has on state budgets as states commit themselves to dollars that just a year ago were being, or 2 years ago, whatever, being borne by the private sector. That also speaks to kind of how folks relate to this point that I made a little bit ago, that these things don't necessarily help them in their communities. And so that was sort of a message that I think did resonate. Folks used it. I know the Governor Beshear's office spent a lot of time talking about that particular issue, as well as vigorously defending public schools in what the role that public schools play in local communities to begin with. And then taking that and sort of, one thing that the voucher lobby is really good at is spending money from billionaire heiresses. One thing they're not very good at is listening to and speaking with folks on the ground in communities that maybe do like their public schools and have a lot to lose. I can't stress enough, as somebody who's read all of the recent legislation, most of the legislation ever written, is if these are very national top-down efforts directed out of DC, directed out of a couple of cities in Texas. These are national efforts. These are national pieces of legislation. These are national talking points that just get shoehorned in to state legislators and shoehorned by extension into communities to try to kind of sell this story that the folks have been trying to sell for 30 years, and it doesn't work very well when they actually try it. So I would say this comment a point that making that vouchers are serving kids already in private schools to begin with, number one, and then taking that as a launching board and sort of going into specific communities and talking about local issues, community issues, issues facing folks, families in those communities, and also vigorous defense of public schools in those communities and the role that those schools play in those communities.
Yes, that's all great. I'll add just a couple of things. As Josh alluded to, pointing out that rural communities do not benefit from vouchers and that they depend so heavily on public schools as the cornerstone of those communities, not just for education, but for employment and for social activities and for social benefits. So that is an effective argument, an argument that's been very effective in places like Texas. What I would say about the recent Supreme Court cases is that while those cases, Espinoza and Carson, have made clear that if a state has a voucher program, if it funds private schools, it needs to include religious schools. Those cases have also repeatedly made very clear that states are not legally obligated to fund vouchers at all. They don't have to fund private schools at all. So the avenue for those states, if they don't want to fund religious schools, which many people still believe in the separation of church and state in this country, then their option is to roll back those voucher programs or to not institute voucher programs. And that avenue is still very much open for states that don't want to divert money to religious schools. It's fine, of course, for families to pay for religious schools themselves if they choose that education. But if states don't want that money to go, public money to go to religious schools, then they have that option of getting rid of their voucher programs. And that can be a very persuasive public policy argument.
That's great. Any word from either of you on further legislative strategies, either affirmative, defensive at the state level, or should we save that for a future a future webinar work or TA session?
I think just people lifting up their voices and calling their representative or even going to testify if there are open hearings in places like New Hampshire. There have been hundreds of people that have showed up to voice or protest against voucher programs. And that is still very impactful to elected officials when people actually show up, because there are a lot more people who oppose voucher programs than promote them. Those who promote them may have more money and resources, but it is such a broad coalition across the country that actually opposes these programs, as we saw in those ballot measures in the November election.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm no political strategist, no read James Carville or Karl Rove or whatever, but I do know that legislators hate taking tough votes, and these voucher bills are really tough votes in these states. Like legislators, even the most self-interested legislators, or perhaps even especially the most self-interested legislators, don't like betraying their communities. And these voucher bills absolutely are a betrayal of their local communities, especially their rural communities. And it's a hard vote for them to have to take. They don't like to have to do it. And the more they hear from folks, both just citizens, sort of individual citizens, but also the groups that work in their communities, volunteer organizations, school organizations, church organizations, for that matter. I mean, a lot of churches are not for this stuff. I think that does help.
Great, thank you. Just turning a little bit back to the federal side, again, sort of like two strands of this. One is that the ECA, the Federal Tax Credit Voucher Bill that you mentioned. What, if anything, can states do to sort of minimize the impact of that should it come to pass? And then also just more generally in terms of, I think there's a lot of interest in the Supreme Court. What, the cases related to vouchers that might go up to the Supreme Court, and how federally and federal courts might be helpful in some of these efforts to turn back vouchers, or worst case scenarios the opposite. But so talk to us more about what we can do about, in response to the federal tax credit voucher bill, and then maybe especially Jessica, a little bit of future forecasting on what we can expect might go up to the Supreme Court, and some things to watch out for there.
So let me just say a couple things about ECA, and then I think that those questions are Jessica to take. As written, the sort of versions of ECA that have gone through the House already, further than they have before, but not quite passing yet, that they're going to reintroduce in January, probably through the budget process that allows them to do it in a simple majority. Um, and I think this came up, maybe you read the question, Bob, or asked the question yourself about sort of how this interacts with state policy in general earlier. The versions of these bills so far would basically creates an incentive. So as Jessica explained at the top, what this version of tax credits would do is essentially allow donors, individual wealthy donors or corporate donors, to divert part of what they owe in this case, federal taxes, to what they call a scholarship granting organization. That's essentially what these tax credits do. And that's already happening at the state level in different state organizations, again, as Jessica stressed. It would explicitly build off of the state's model. But to interact with those state models, the legislation uh, would only count those deductions after the state credits had already been applied, which effectively creates an incentive to donors to donate to these scholarship granting organizations, these voucher distribution organizations. Let's be clear about what they are, despite the pretty name. To donate to these voucher distribution organizations in states that don't have vouchers already. So if you've got 15 grand to donate to a voucher distribution organization and you want that to have the fullest impact, you can take 5 grand of that and apply it in a state that already has a state tax credit for these voucher systems on the side, and you can apply your whole 10 grand or another 15 grand if you want at the federal and spread it out across 3 states. It's capped at a certain amount of donation depending on the organization. So some of those details could get tweaked a little bit depending on kind of how this rolls out. But as of right now, effectively what this does is create an incentive for donors to donate to voucher distribution organizations in states that don't have vouchers. And because there's a spending limit on this, either 5 billion or 10 billion, depending on the bill that goes through, it's a lot of money, particularly when you think about how much that could be distributed across different states. What that means is that there really is an incentive to maximize your donations to states that don't already have them. In just the same way, in some sense, that sort of there's incentives to give to political candidates who may be in competitive races or maybe in races that they don't have local fundraising sources for. This bill creates an incentive to donate to states that don't have vouchers, which means the impact of a federal voucher bill will be felt disproportionately in states that don't have vouchers. And that's precisely the point. They already got $1 billion being spent on vouchers in Arizona or Florida or Ohio, in each of those states, well over $1 billion. The point of a federal voucher bill through the tax code is to ram these vouchers through at a state level on the federal dime.
Absolutely. In places that would not be able to pass a voucher bill in their state legislature. One thing that I will mention that states can do to counteract the threat of this federal voucher legislation, in addition, of course, to helping to oppose its passage, is to make sure that their state education funding is adequate and is equitably distributed. So Education Law Center's annual Making the Grade report, the new version will come out soon, but the 2023 version is available. It shows, as in past years, that many states are not living up to the fiscal effort that they need to expend in order to make sure that their public schools have adequate state funding, and also that many are still regressively distributing their state education funding, meaning that they are giving less money to higher need districts, higher poverty districts than to more wealthy districts. So states need to fix this. States should be able to count on the federal education dollars that are promised through programs like Title I and through IDEA, which unfortunately is never fully funded. But they need to also take it upon themselves to make sure that their state dollars to education are adequate, and that it will be $1 own bulwark against the money that they might lose, that they might get even less federal funding for education if some of that federal money that's going toward education is actually now going toward private schools through a federal voucher program. Turning now to the other thing you mentioned, Bob, about the lawsuits that are going on to try to expand the Espinoza and Carson holdings. We won't go into a ton of detail about them here. Public Funds Public Schools just put out a blast about an amicus brief that we wrote in one of these cases called Crosspoint Church, and we encourage you to read that. And I think we can drop it in the chat here and also to read the amicus brief. But basically, these are lawsuits in which religious schools are saying that now that they're allowed to participate in the town tuitioning programs in Maine and other states, that they are unfairly being subjected to anti-discrimination requirements of those programs. We, of course, believe that they should be subject to those anti-discrimination requirements, but these are cases where private religious schools are trying to expand the money that they can receive and at the same time not be subject to educational standards, including anti-discrimination standards that states are trying to oppose. And again, these are very important cases that we can't let fly under the radar, that we need people to know about, and we need people to know that at least part of the private school community is advocating to be exempt even more from anti-discrimination laws, which of course hurts many of our vulnerable student groups.
Thank you, Jessica. And I do think that this issue about how voucher programs and religious entities can use the First Amendment free exercise clause to trump, sorry to use that verb, but to trump anti-discrimination laws in the states. I think that's one of the biggest legal issues that may come before the U.S. Supreme Court before too long. And the other issue, which is a little bit adjacent to this conversation, is around the idea that religious schools could become part of the public school system altogether, as is being demonstrated by the litigation in Oklahoma around the Catholic Church attempting to be part of the public school system through virtual charter schools. So those issues are, in that case, the adjacent case from the Oklahoma Attorney General is also already on cert to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we'll have to see whether that issue becomes a real live issue in the upcoming Supreme Court term. So these are very heady issues that we're facing both federally and at the state level. We only have a few more minutes here, but I think I would like to just maybe ask a summative question of both of our panelists. Just any concluding thoughts about what we learned during the Trump 1.0 session term that we need to basically rely on and use now and heed now as we prepare for Trump 2.0. And we have listeners here from blue states and red states. So any parting observations on sort of how we approach the states where there are super majorities of Republicans in the legislature and probably on the court, and those where we still have some Democratic opposition to vouchers in the state systems, and so how that might look differently in the next 4 years. So either of those questions I pose to either of you, and then we'll close out our session.
I guess I would just say, and shamelessly plug from an argument that I make in my book that, it's really hard to overstate just how awful the results of voucher systems have been for kids over the last decade or so. Not only because these things disproportionately go to kids who are already in private schools, I've mentioned, but academically, the results for kids who do switch are devastating. The amount of subprime schools propped up by these things, new revenue sources and new revenue streams diverted to churches that are running schools. The DeVos folks actually have a whole campaign to save our Catholic schools. It's basically a school choice sign up sheet to try to get voucher bills through. and a huge revolving door of kids coming in and out of these voucher systems, whether because they're expelled or because it just wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. To say nothing of the disability issues that Jessica raised, and some of the just sort of walking right up to the line of overt discrimination on this stuff. At the same time as all of these things, as we've learned all this stuff fairly conclusively, as almost as conclusively as I'm a social scientist by training, as social scientists can get in this issue, we saw during the first Trump term, um, really kind of the right wing folks pushing these things, leaning increasingly heavily into culture war language, talking about bathrooms and where kids go to school, where do kids go to the bathroom in school, talking about locker rooms, talking about team sports, talking about LGBTQ content in books, making claims as Ron DeSantis did in Florida just after signing the nation's biggest voucher bill that perhaps slavery had economic benefits for enslaved people, and we should have curricula that suggests that. I can't stress enough just how much those culture wars have sort of saved the voucher push over the last few years, and particularly as those devastating results for kids and families really started to manifest across the country. It's really been the culture wars holding these things together. And so I don't know, I've written quite a bit over the last couple of months saying that I think that the Trump 2.0 is going to usher in a new era of what I call the politics of humiliation when it comes to targeting vulnerable communities in schools. I think there's going to be more of that, both in public schools for kids who stay in public schools, and as a motivation to push these things further, just in the name of so-called parents' rights or something like that. So I think we need to be on the watch for that. I think we need to defend that, particularly as lessons that get learned from some election postmortems is that we shouldn't talk about these types of things and sort of let Republicans own the landscape and the language on this stuff. I reject that idea. But at the end of the day, I think what all this comes down to is sort of I'll close with the theme that I've been sort of trying to beat this whole session. At the end of the day, this is really all the stuff is about how families are helped in their communities, and where are the organizations, whether they're schools, whether they're volunteer groups, whether they're parents groups, whatever, that are best positioned to meet the needs of communities and diverse learners across those communities. And the answer is public schools in that case. So I would stress just further conversations as all this culture war noise continues for as long as it needs to continue for these folks to get it out of their system. And it could take a few more years. I think sort of just reemphasizing what happens and how schools benefit kids and families in local communities, I think is the way to go. And that's certainly what I plan to be doing.
Thank you. And thank you all again for being here. What did we learn from Trump 1.0? I think it's that we have many and excellent tools to fight this, and we have many and excellent people to fight this, and that we can be successful. So a few examples: state litigation, of course, continued during the first Trump administration, was able to be successful against vouchers. Federal litigation continued and was able to be successful, like the NAACP versus DeVos lawsuit that I mentioned that kept $1 billion in public schools, where we and others were very proud to represent the NAACP and parents and districts across the country. Federal advocacy can still be effective, as was shown in federal voucher legislation that was also a priority in Trump 1 and didn't go anywhere, as well as things that were also proposed then, like eliminating the Department of Education. And that we have people of goodwill across the country and bipartisan support for public schools, as Josh mentioned, was shown in the most recent election. So we need to be clear-eyed that this is going to be very hard. It may even be harder than the last time, but we have so many organizations and so many individuals across the country who support their public schools for many different reasons, and we need to appeal to them in many different ways, but who support their public schools and create a very big tent against private school voucher programs. We have worked with so many of you who are on the webinar here, or others who you know. We want to work with even more of you. So we answer dozens and dozens of requests for assistance at Public Funds Public Schools. And please send us more. And we also work with dozens of organizations across the country, and we are eager to work with you too. We can't do it without you. We all obviously can't do it without each other. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Josh and Jessica, for your really insightful comments today on this problem. By way of conclusion, one person mentioned in the chat, and by the way, we're going to tabulate all these questions and consider whether we need to put out some future materials or in future webinars sort of address some of them more specifically. But thank you for all the questions in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but they're very insightful, and we'll take account of those for future sessions. But one person mentioned in the chat that, we can all agree that whatever district we come from or live in, red, blue, or purple, that vouchers are not good for schools, for students, for public education, or for democracy. And so I think this is our North Star as we move forward, that we need to really take stock of this very, one of the most pressing issues in our democracy, I think, for the next 4 years is keeping a public education system as the cornerstone of democracy alive. So I'm very hopeful and more optimistic that because of all of you, that we will have a coalition and be more organized than ever to resist these efforts. We will develop a comprehensive legal strategy. We will and do have a comprehensive legislative strategy moving forward. And so we want to be in partnership with all of you and keep in touch. Do take care of yourselves. And as a parting note, it's really exhausting to be in these fights and to have witnessed what we witnessed a couple of weeks ago. And I know that we're seeing the exhaustion all across the landscape in the advocacy world. But let's take care of each other. Take care of yourselves as we gird up for the next 4 years. Get that downtime. Let's support each other and rejuvenate each other as we march forward in these next 4 years. So thank you again, and stay tuned for our future webinars again on school funding and discrimination issues. And we thank you again for attending today, and we'll talk to you again very shortly in the future.
Bye,
Take
everyone.
care, everyone.